Good morning, student. Welcome back to your online business study class. And today we will be discussing about another source of business finance, and that is factoring. Factoring is the third source of business finance which we are going to study today. And this basically say factoring is a financial services under which the factor render various services which include. Now you have to understand what is factoring. Factoring basically say that because a organization owner has lots of work, right? And whenever there is a trading done between a organization owner, it means something is sold by a seller to a purchaser. Sometimes this trading is also in a form of credit, यानी credit में ये trading होती है. Now the owner will be responsible, and or you can say the seller will be responsible for this trade credit also, or he will be responsible to see that the person or the customer who has purchased or who has dealt in a form of credit will also repay him the amount. So in this manner he will not able to give his time to those important activity which he or she is supposed to give. So factoring is the solution of that problem. Factoring is basically involvement of three person into a selling and purchasing process. The one is the seller who sold the thing on credit. The second is the purchaser who purchased the thing on credit. And the third is the factor, who is a person who provides services to the seller by having a contract where he will be responsible for the purpose of receiving the seller amount of credit which was dealt within the purchaser. यानी सेलर और परचेजर के बीच में जो क्रेडिट में एक ट्रेडिंग हुई है उसकी अमाउंट को सेलर को रिसीव करने का जो वर्क होता है, रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी होती है, दैट गोज टू द थर्ड पर्सन एंड दैट पर्सन इज कॉल्ड एज फैक्टरिंग. Right? Now that person is called as factor, and this whole process is called as the process of factoring. Now factor charge fees for the service render. So the services which a factor is going to provide to the seller, for this a particular fixed charge by a factor. And factoring appeared on the Indian financial scene only in the early 19 as a result of RBI initiative, and the services of factoring is provided after the initiative taken by Reserve Bank of India after in the beginning of 19th century. The organization that provides such services means factoring services जो organization provide करती हैं, that example was SBI, Commercial Services, Canara Bank, Formas Factor Bank, State Bank of India, Canara Bank, Punjab National Bank, Allahabad Bank. So these are all the banking sectors, and there are certain non-banking sectors also which are providing, which are hiring the agencies which work as a factor services. Now, what are the different services which factor provide? So the first services which factor provide is discounting of bills which are in the form of with or without recourse, यानी उन बिल्स को डिस्काउंट कराना जो कि रिकोर्स के साथ में है या विदाउट रिकोर्स फैसिलिटी के. नाउ इट इज़ द ड्यूटी ऑफ अ फैक्टर दैट ही नीड टू कलेक्शन ऑफ द क्लाइंट डेब्ट्स, यानी जो उसके क्लाइंट हैं जिसने फैक्टर को अपॉइंट कर रखा है, दैट पर्सन इज़ नोन एज द क्लाइंट. राइट? तो फैक्टर का क्लाइंट कौन हो गया? सेलर हो गया. राइट? तो इट बिकम द ड्यूटी ऑफ द फैक्टर to collect the bills or to collect the debts of his client. Under this, the receivable on the account of sale of goods or services are sold to a factor at a certain discount. यानी यहाँ पे होता क्या है, जो क्लाइंट होता है, सेलर होता है, एक पर्टिकुलर अमाउंट में कुछ डिस्काउंट के साथ में गुड्स और सर्विसेज को सोल्ड करता है फैक्टर्स को एक डिस्काउंट के साथ में. नाउ विद इन दैट डिस्काउंट द फैक्टर बिकम रिस्पॉन्सिबल for all credit control and debt collection from the buyer and provide protection against any bad debt losses to the firm. Now here you can understand it. Suppose I am a seller, I want to sold my product to somebody else, right? Now I have a doubt that if I am going to be engaged in a process of credit selling, यानी जहाँ पे मैं immediate cash payment ना मुझे purchaser करे और credit में payment करे, so it might be that in future the debt can arise, right? So in that way I will use the third person who will be playing a link between me and the customer, right? So instead of selling the product directly to the customer, I will be handing over that to the third person, the middle person, who will be known as a factor. That factor person will be responsible for the credit selling of that goods to the customer, and also will responsible to see that the amount will given back to the client within a particular time, and no risk of bad debt will arise. So this is the first thing which is done by the factor. Now next is providing information about credit worthiness of the prospective client. Now factor is not only responsible to see that the risk of bad debt should not arise, it is also the responsibility of a factors to see that a person with whom they are going to be they are going to engage into trading, to take out the history of that organization and fund, to check out the financial condition of that organization and fund, and to see that the payment can be get properly or not, right? Now this is all about factor. Now what type of advantage a organization will be getting who has the factoring policy in their firm? The first advantage will be that obtaining fund through factoring is cheaper than financing through other means such as bank credit. It means if a organization is getting funds by the help of factoring, अगर एक organizations को जो fund obtain हो रहा है factors के through, that is always cheaper if they are getting the fund by bank in a form of credit. यानी अगर एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन फर्म जो है अपने फंड्स को बैंक से क्रेडिट लेके अरेंज करती है, तो दे हैव टू पे इंटरेस्ट अमाउंट टू देम, बट इन केस ऑफ फैक्टरिंग जहाँ पे वो अपना पूरा गुड्स उसको दे देगी एक डिस्काउंटिंग अमाउंट पे फैक्टर्स को, और फैक्टर्स की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी होती है उस गुड्स को सोल्ड करना और अमाउंट को रीपे करना क्लाइंट को. सो इन दैट केस में फंड जो आ रहा है वहाँ पे, so that fund is more cheaper. The second is, with cash flow accelerated by factoring, the client is able to meet his or her liabilities promptly as and when they are arise. Now, in case of factoring, there is a proper cash flow. There is a proper cash flow means the client, because the factor is responsible for giving a proper amount to the client of the product, right? So the client will not have any issue about the cash flow condition of a company, and if there is any liability of the client, they can able to pay out these liabilities. Next is, factoring as a source of fund is flexible and ensure a definite pattern of cash inflow from credit sale. It provides security for debt that a firm might otherwise be unable to obtain. Now, factoring is basically means where a third person is responsible to see that the debts will not arise. So, what will happen in that way? It is basically a fund is flexible. Hey, we are knowing that there will be a proper inflow of cash into a company or a firm because there is somebody who is providing security for that debt that a firm might otherwise be not able to obtain it. It does not create any charges on the assets of the firm. Now factoring is not providing any charge on the assets of a firm. जो factor होता है third person, he is only involved in the process of selling and purchasing. He is playing a mediator role between the seller and the customer. उसका assets पे कोई link नहीं होता. So यहाँ पे क्या नहीं होते, कोई charges create नहीं होते हैं assets पे factoring process में. Next is, the client can concentrate on other functional areas of business as the responsibility of credit control is shouldered by the factor. Now, what was the main objective of appointing a factor? So that the person who is running the business or the seller can go through with the other main important activity of a business, और जो उसके क्रेडिट अचीव करने के वर्क है, क्रेडिट कंट्रोल करने का काम है, वो कौन करेगा? फैक्टर विल डू दैट. Now, what are the different limitations if we are appointing a factor as a source of finance? Now, first is, this source is expensive when the invoices are numerous and smaller in amount. Now, as I told you that factor we are appointing, we have to pay a particular amount of fees to him. Now, these fees we are paying him according to the bill system. यानी जितने बिलिंग होती हैं उन बिल पे हमें उसको फीस पे करनी पड़ती है. कि सपोज अगर 2 लाख का कोई बिल है क्रेडिट पे किसी कस्टमर्स को, सो इफ़ आई एम गिविंग दैट बिल टू द फैक्टर कि मुझे इन बिल की रीपेमेंट चाहिए, सो मैं उसको जो फीस दूंगी दैट आई एम गोइंग टू गिव हिम ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ बिल्स. ना इफ bill will be many and it will be no matter small, I have to give him fees according to the bill repayment only. वो जितने बिलों की मुझे रिपेमेंट करेगा फैक्टर्स को मुझे उतनी फीस देनी पड़ेगी. सो इन केस इट इज़ एक्सपेंसिव, इन केस द इन्वॉइसेस आर न्यूमरस, यानी बहुत सारे इन्वॉइसेस हैं और छोटी छोटी अमाउंट में हैं, बिकॉज जो पेमेंट होती है फैक्टर्स की वो इन्वॉइसेस के नंबर्स के बेसिस पे होती है. Next is the advance finance provided by the factor firm is generally available at a higher interest cost than the usual rate of interest. It means sometimes the factor also provide the advance fund to the his client, but जो इसका rate of interest होता है that is always high or mostly high in case of after comparison of other sources. Next is the factor is third party to the customer who may not feel comfortable while dealing with it. Now, the main party engaged here in the selling and purchasing is seller and purchaser, but who is the third person? It is factor, who is appointed by a seller to deal with the credit control. So, sometime what happened, because the factor is a third party and now he is going to deal with the customer, because even the customer also know that he is not the main person. So, sometimes this dealing is not comfortable. Right, so this was all about the factory, the third source of finance, and now the next is lease financing. Now, lease financing, children, it's very easy term. You can understand it as a form of renting also. Right, it means जहाँ पे क्या करती है एक organization instead of purchasing any assets, what they used to rent out the assets, यानी they used to lease out the assets. वो एक particular amount as a form of rent पे दे के assets को use करती है. So that is called as lease financing. Now you can see here a lease is a contractual agreement where one party, the owner of an assets, grant the other party the right to use the assets in return for a periodic payment. Right, it means lease क्या है, एक contract agreement हो गया जिसमें two parties are involved. The one party who has the assets and the other party who want to use that assets in a form of return of a particular payment will be called as lease financing. You can understand lease financing as a form of renting of assets also for some specified period, यानी कुछ एक particular period के लिए assets को rent पे देना is also called as lease financing. Now assets belong to somebody else. It means assets होती किसी अपने owners की, and that person is known, that owner of the asset is called as lessor, LESSOR, and the party who is going to use that assets after giving a particular periodic payment is going to called as lessee, LESSEE. So that is the reason we say that lease financing is a contract between two person, lessor, the owner of assets, and lessee, the person who is going to use that assets in a return for a periodic payment. Right, now the lease payer is a fixed periodic amount called as lease rental to the lessor for the use of assets. It means the lessee has to pay a fixed periodic amount to the lessor after using their assets. The term and condition regulating the lease arrangements are given in the lessee lease contract. At the end of lease period, the assets goes back to lessor. यानी जो एसेट्स के यूज़ करने के लिए जितने भी टर्म कंडीशंस होंगे, जो पेमेंट की टर्म कंडीशन होगी, दैट ऑल विल बी रिटन इनटू अ कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एंड दैट कॉन्ट्रैक्ट इज नोन एज लीज कॉन्ट्रैक्ट. Once the contract period get over, right, it means the time of period will be also written into the lease contract, and once the lease contract period get over, the assets will go back to lessor. Lessor means जो assets का real owner था. Lease finance provide an important means of modernizations and diversifications of firm. Such type of financing is more prevalent in the acquisition of such assets as computers and electronic equipment, which become absolute quicker because of the fast changing technological development. It means lease financing हम कहाँ पे use करते हैं? We basically use lease financing in those areas where the technology and the assets get absolute, यानी जहाँ पे टेक्नोलॉजी और जो एसेट्स होती है बहुत जल्दी पुरानी हो जाती है, which need to be modified time to time. So instead of purchasing the assets, what we do, we used to take these assets on a form of rent. तो here we can understand lease financing क्या है. Lease financing is basically a contract or agreement between two party where the one party who is the assets of owner of the asset called as lessor give the use give his assets for using to the lessee who is going to use it in a form of giving a particular payment. Now once the period of the lease will over, that assets will go back to the owner, that is called as lessor, and there will be a written agreement where all the terms and condition will be related regarding the assets and its use. That contract is called as lease contract. Now let's see what are the advantage of lease contracting or lease financing. So first is it enable the lessee to acquire the asset with a lower investment. Now if instead of purchasing the assets, एक फर्म जिसको एसेट्स की ज़रूरत है अगर वो उसे परचेज करती है तो वहाँ पे उसे क्या करना पड़ेगा, एक हाई अमाउंट में इन्वेस्टमेंट करना पड़ेगा, राइट. Now if instead of purchasing the assets we are using that assets as a form of lease, अगर हम लीज में किसी assets को रेंट पे ले रहे हैं और उसे यूज़ कर रहे हैं तो हमारा जो इन्वेस्टमेंट हो जाएगा वो क्या हो जाएगा, रिड्यूस हो जाएगा. सो एक फर्स्ट एडवांटेज व्हाट लीज फाइनेंसिंग इज गिविंग, दैट लीज फाइनेंसिंग इज एक्वायरिंग द एसेट्स विद अ लोअर इन्वेस्टमेंट. Next is simple documentation make it easier to finance assets. Now at the time of making lease contract also we have to make a very simple documentations which make it very easy for the client to go through with the process of lease financing. Next is lease rental paid by the lessee are deductible for computing taxable profit. It means the amount of lease यानी एक assets को यूज़ करने के लिए जो रेंट की अमाउंट जो लीजी देता है वो क्या होती है, टैक्स डिडक्टेबल होती है. तो जो टैक्स की अमाउंट पे करनी पड़ेगी लेजी को, वो कैसे करनी पड़ेगी, कम पे करनी पड़ेगी अगर वो रेंट में पेमेंट कर रहा है तो. नेक्स्ट इज इट प्रोवाइड फाइनेंस विदाउट डायलेटिंग द ओनरशिप और कंट्रोल ऑफ बिजनेस. Now what is happening here, we are arranging finance here, राइट. हम फाइनेंस को अरेंज करें, एसेट्स को अरेंज करें और कैसे कर रहे हैं, बाय टेकिंग दैट एसेट्स इन अ फॉर्म ऑफ रेंट. सो नीदर द लेजर इज गिविंग एनी पावर, ना तो लेजर से कोई भी कंट्रोल ओनरशिप जा रही है लेजी को, ना ही लेजी की कोई भी ओनरशिप किसको जा रही है, लेजर को जा रही है. नेक्स्ट इज द लीज एग्रीमेंट डज नॉट अफेक्ट द डेप्ट रेजिंग कैपेसिटी ऑफ एन इंटरप्राइज, यानी द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन who is going to take the assets in a form of rent, his debt raising capacity is not going to be affected by lease agreement. यानी वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो रेंट पे ले रही एसेट्स को वो कितना डेप्ट यूज़ करने वाली, रेज करने वाली है, दैट इज़ नॉट गोइंग टू बी अफेक्टेड बाय दिस कॉन्ट्रैक्ट. नेक्स्ट इज द रिस्क ऑफ obsolescence is borne by the lessor. This allow greater flexibility to the lessee to replace the asset. It means because there are certain assets which need to modify time to time, which need to upgrade it time to time, so this risk is not there, or this risk is going to be borne by the lessor. So here what is happening, in case the lessee want to change the assets, he want to replace the assets, the easily it can be replaced. Now the limitation of lessor financing. The first is a lease financing or lease arrangement may impose certain restriction on the use of assets. It means wherever we are taking assets in a rent, sometime it happened that the contract, lease contract में there are certain restrictions which are written that how we will be using that assets, और उस restrictions को ही हमें use करनी पड़ती हैं. Next is the normal business operation may be affected in case the lease is not renewed. It means in case we have taken assets for a rent of one period and after one period we feel that we should be using it for a future also, हमें उसे future में भी ज़रूरत पड़ती है आगे के time के लिए भी, और in case we have not renewed it after 1 year, then the lessor will become the owner of that assets and he will take the assets back. So in that case अगर रिन्यूड नहीं हुई है लीज कॉन्ट्रैक्ट, सो जो हमारे बिजनेस ऑपरेशंस हैं वो निगेटिवली इफेक्ट हो जाएंगे. नेक्स्ट इज इट मे रिजल्ट इन हायर पे आउट ऑब्लिगेशन इन केस द इक्विपमेंट इज नॉट फाउंड यूजफुल
and lessee opt for premature termination of the lease agreement. Now, this is very important that when we talk about a lease agreement, the period of agreement is also written over there, that this assets belong to lessee for how much particular period of time. In case it's written that the amount of the rent is also written over there, no matter for what period of time the lessee used the assets. If lessee found that the asset is not useful or written it before also, so what will happen, even premature termination of lease agreement, he need to pay out the full amount. Next is the lessee never become the owner of the asset. It deprive him of the residual value of the assets. Now, this is already we have discussed that when we talk about lease financing, there is a particular period of time where the lessor is providing that assets to lessee as a form of rent after getting a periodic installment. Once that period get over, the lessor will again become the owner of the assets. So this is again one of the drawback for lessee. The lessee will never become the owner of the asset. So this was all about the lease financing. In our next video, we will be discussing about the another source of financing, that was public deposit.